Sup guys, we finally got the most requested deck profile, and that is Premium Gavrail. Before I move on, this is basically your standard crit build, but I take a more defensive and toolboxy approach, which means there's going to be a lot of information that I can't fit into one video without it being hella long, so always feel free to ask about stuff, and let's just start because I may talk too much in this one. Any V-starter for the draw and quick shield. For those that don't know, Angel Feather can utilize quick shields, including now Guardian shields, protect markers, and turn them to heals. Basically, you have optional skills to place these pseudo cards into the damage zone, and then they would disappear since they cannot exist there, essentially healing you. Just a neat little gimmick since we have those options for deck building, but that aside, V-Stars are just the safest option right now and is still going to be for a good while. Grade 3s we have G Gavrail, who is back stronger than ever and of course enables our history collection stride. She provides us resources and filtering with the stride bonus. Her GB2 also allows you to start tanking up on your opponent's turn, because as your damage zone sees 1 damage in any way, you're immediately on force numbers, which is pretty helpful to cut off magic numbers and basically makes it so that each shield in your hand becomes a little bit more valuable. And it stacks. You really don't need V Gavrail anymore because trying to OTK with Hamiel on turn 3 really doesn't fly these days in Premium. The fact that G Gavrail does something going first and second, it's a lot more game changing because we can focus on farming and setting up so that we can more utilize Angel's toolbox instead. And for that, we really only need to see her. While she didn't change the deck by a huge margin, the fact that she gives us sustained plussing and extra durability, it covers those weaknesses it had before, so she's a very welcome addition. Hamiel. Still your best form of pressure and still one of your win cons. She's also your biggest magnet for targeted removal, so it's really important to have matchup knowledge and read game states first when using her Counterblast 3. Instead of YOLOing too hard with her, she's gotta be used as bait sometimes because we don't actually need her to win every single game. But because she's still a very pressuring unit to deal with, we rely on her to at least push. Her other skill is just very nice. It's free, builds a board, and rescues, which is great for fishing for triggers, because triggers are our main source of dealing damage. Also, if you really need an on-place marker, you can just ride into Hamiel. Your key cards actually don't need a Gavrail named Vanguard. The important cards require black in their name, which Hamiel has, so she's actually fine as Vanguard still. Really good card compression Hamiel. And Overdress tech, Relentless Dragon. He checks the top of the deck to call it or discard it. That is wildly random and sacky, but we don't really care about the call. His purpose is to put himself into Soul, because getting a grade 3 in Soul is very important to meet in certain win con. Seeing him ensures that condition, which you sometimes struggle doing because Hamiel can also put herself into Soul, which would normally set you up for that, but if your opponent denies that, it becomes increasingly hard to do throughout the game because then you would have to rely on rewriting, which you won't be able to all the time. So this is a searchable tech option that can do so safely in the main phase. Otherwise, he's Stride Fodder or a Soul Charger, both of which are still pretty good for the deck anyways. Now we have the grade 2s. For Jafkiel, the best and most versatile toolbox in the entire clan. She's a plus by adding any card from damage to hand and rescues, grabbing key pieces for combos or defense, and she's great for the early game as well. Not just for building advantage, but for early pressure since she gains 3k and potentially hitting triggers from her rescue. Rushing can sometimes be important to start eating away resources or pushing for damage early on so that it can be easier to pressure later on in the game. She's easily a staple at forward that you want to maximize your chances of seeing her to use her every single turn possible. 3 Salafiel. Unlike Hamiel and Jafkiel where they counterblast, she Soul Blast instead, so she essentially countercharges. She rescues, and during your turn, if your damage zone sees a new card, she gains 10k, making her your biggest standalone beater. That doesn't really seem like much, but she's another one of your early game tools. It's a continuous skill, so as long as they don't deal with her, you can get constant pressure going since you're doing something with your damage zone every turn. She's a consistent 19k, which is quite big in the early game, especially against Excel and Protect decks to hit over magic numbers. Later on in the game, she does fall off a bit, but she's still great for crit fishing and just for being an on-demand countercharger for when you need it. Sariel. She's a consistency booster. She can semi-search any normal unit from deck to damage zone. She does require combo pieces to maximize her skill, but with all the recursion cards we have, it's fairly easy when you need to see certain pieces without the RNG aspect of rescue checks. Her other skill, you sometimes find a lot of your units will fight for field time due to rescue spamming, so she can move back and boost for a grade 2, which may come up if you want to min-max with a 9k booster or something. This skill is niche, but overall, when you see her, you see any normal unit. Zabania. First, she actually has like 2 erratas which they fix with a reprint from History Collection, so always refer to that text because that's the correct one. She's just an extra rescue checker from G, but not considered part of the V-Core. She's a bit more costly but instead offers a bit more utility over the others. She calls units like Hamiel, and can be used as an extender for multi-attacks on Uriel turns. She's also one way to turn your pseudo cards into heals, because her cost puts any card from hand into damage, which then allows the healing interaction, and of course she rescues. She has cool gimmicks, but due to how slow and clunky she is, she's not needed, but it's nice to have for utility, and she isn't hard once per turn like the others. Grade 1s. Zophiel. the last rescue checker of the main deck. Her cost is discard 1 to add a card from damage zone to hand, so she's another on-demand countercharger. Great for toolboxing and rescues. She's also your optimal ride target going second, because on Vanguard, on hit, you draw 1, so she gives some nice pressure as soon as you attack with her. Many decks want the damage riding up, so this puts your opponent at an awkward situation to whether they should take it or not. Either way, you're drawing or they're discarding. That's actually pressuring for your opponent. Nakir, our standard grade 3 top checker, and she's one of the better ones since her condition to gain 5k is super easy. She's a constant 13k, so another nice early game tool to poke away with. One of the problems of this deck is not being able to output much pressure due to low power, so the 13k puts us at peak numbers when boosting columns, especially in tandem with our finishers. Like all the clones of this card, she finds you all your grade 3s and filters for triggers, basic stuff. Bellyful Meds. She doubles as a countercharger and soul charger. She swaps a card from hand and damage, which can allow a ton of combo potential, but more importantly, you sometimes have a lot of soul intensive plays, so a soul charger is sometimes pretty needed if you're just going nuts with soul. Remember that we need to also keep a grade 3 in soul. We don't want to soul blast out of way unless you really have to. And this is the reason why we must have a grade 3 in soul, Lamedo. This is that so-called win con. It's essentially Hamiel 2.0, even though this card came out first, but whatever. He's actually a lot more threatening since you could put him behind anything and give them Sentinel Restrict like Hamiel. But as opposed to Hamiel herself, this card is very hard to stop once boosting. What it comes down to most of the time when guarding Vanguard swings are perfect guards, because there are variants in those. So if you put him behind your Vanguard, he forces your opponent to hard guard, using up quality cards, or they can take risks and no guarding. When you combine this with the constant rescues and drive checks we get, it's really scary because this can threaten lethal at any time due to all the crits you play. He can be a bit slow, but once he's online, this is a win con that could potentially win you more games than anything else in this deck, which says a lot about this deck by the way. You can try more copies to see him more, or for a possible turn-wise Sentinel Restricts. Our hand trap that's not really a hand trap, OG grade 1 no seals. When placed on Guardian Circle, she lets us swap a card from hand and damage, letting us countercharge on your opponent's turn. That's basically one way to offset the high costs from cards like Hamiel, which then helps with surviving on your opponent's turn by grabbing defensive pieces or grabbing pieces for your follow-up turn. And now with Gavrail, no seal can also trigger a GB2 effect to gain 2k defensively. Somehow this card just keeps gaining value even after 10 years in counting. Oh, also, I want to clarify something about her interaction with pseudo cards, basically the same healing gimmick from before. Can no seal swap a quick shield from hand into the damage zone? According to Bushi, no she cannot. Quick shields and the like are not proper Angel Feather cards. The text on quick shields, stating that it is regarded as being from all clans, is just a reminder telling us that it can be used in any deck. The reason why cards like Gavrail Prim or Zabaneo works is because their cost says choose a card, which doesn't specify what card it has to be. A quick shield is still a card, therefore they can be used for their cost. But no seal specifically states Angel Feather, so she cannot swap quick shields, and this includes Guardian shields as well as protect markers. I actually see plenty of people making this mistake, but unfortunately no seal can't swap pseudo cards. If only though. Hanali's MVP against multi-attack. The errata conveniently fixed all of its issues. It's searchable, easy to set up, and just combining Hanali with Angel's natural bulkiness adds yet another layer of defense. Combine this with the ability to play a deny game, you can use this to somewhat control the flow of the game like how DP would. You will want to keep some decks in check because multi-attack is still king in this game. Make sure to adjust the number of Hanalis for your own meta though. Last grade 1, of course, we have Sanctitude. Because this is a slower deck, one of your biggest weaknesses are guard restricts. Our defensive plays and farming wouldn't really matter much if we can't even use them, so this is a 1-card PG in most instances. This and triggers can't be searched, but orders can be added back from damage and technically it's easier to find with our constant digging. Amazing generic card in premium. Now for the triggers, and it's as standard as it can get. Stride crits for striding, and we really like crits, all in one. GB crit for more crits. 10k into soul is sometimes relevant. Gavrail crits. These are the errata crits for us. All the buffs to it are great, and the best thing of all, she draws when checked as damage because that's super appreciated no matter what you're playing. Always count your cards when you're near deck out because when checked from rescue checks, you also draw from this since they are counted as damage, which technically has a lot of synergy, but this can still potentially mess up your plays if you're not keeping track. We're constantly fighting against deck out due to how fast we go through the deck, so always be mindful of the possibility of drawing when you do your rescues, but can't complain about more defense, right? Sentinel crits. Protect decks honestly got a little shafted when it comes to the V retrains for their draw crits, because their Sentinel crits all share the same name, so we have to choose to play one or the other or a mix. I personally chose a 2 and 2 split to allocate the rest of my Sentinel slots here since we really want to maximize crits as much as possible, and since we have ways to guarantee PGs that we can afford to play these. The 30k is actually very comfy and it's sometimes more than enough to guard a big attack, but mostly we just want crit compression because crits wins games. I played the one random draw PG. This can easily be a crit and you can swap it out for grade 1 PGs instead. But I play the 1 because it's a PG, which combos with the main stride to get more drives. It's also a PG that can be placed from anywhere, so it can combo one of your heal guardians to bypass guard restricts, or some rather. And you can set this up where you can guarantee you this PG for your opponent's turn. This way you can always have a PG locked and loaded. Remember to keep track of these drawing when near deck out. Everyone's favorite stand trigger, Gavrail. Now it's pretty much relegated to helping you recycle cards, mainly the triggers along with itself while also countercharging. It's never a bad thing putting triggers back into rotation. It's also my one sacky way of multi-attacking, so if you play it too, make sure to plan your attack lines with the possibility of this spooking your opponent. Otherwise, easy replacement for another crit. I personally like this card in case I see too many triggers early on. Heals. 3 heal guardians and 1 resource heal. Heal guardians are still necessary for the early game. Some decks can just be very explosive and will just push way too hard. If you have these in the early game and feel the need to drop it, just do it. Playing the catch-up game can be rough with this deck, and you don't want to get overwhelmed too hard even though we need damage for our plays. This is a deck that can play the long game, but if you're just rushed down to death, there's sometimes no coming back from it. We can now recycle everything, so don't get greedy and just drop it if you feel the need to get out of the early game safely. Now the resource heal, we can run into both countercharge and soul charge problems, and this lets us do either in the late game. These heals are much better in the late game, but I would prioritize surviving first with the heal guardians before even thinking about playing these. It's just to help recover both resource pools that we use often. And lastly, the Great OT. This one is an extra crit and lets us add anything back from drop to hand, which is perfect for this deck. OTs can actually be super unfair in Angel Feather because we have a much greater chance of seeing it with all the checks we do, but the most disgusting thing is pairing OTs with Sentinel restricts. If you can stack this at the right time and they can't answer a 100 mil Sentinel restrict along with a bunch of stacked criticals, yeah, you're probably winning that game. Also, don't be afraid to guard with this as well. Again, we can recycle this too if it isn't removed already. Arguably the most unfair thing about this deck, so you have to play it as long as it's legal. Finally, the G-Zone. Of course, we have Harmonics. Staple forever in Premium. It's got niche effects for damage denial and locking, but lock isn't a major issue since our main stride inherently unlocks anyways, so we don't really need to go into this, and we will also never flip this, so really, none of these skills matter too much. It's really just here for going second. The 20k shield is really where it's at. Extra defense is appreciated no matter what, and it's another order card for those specific matchups as well as doing healing plays if you want. Auto include. Uriel, which is your history collection stride. I basically already talked about her on Gavrail. We can now superior stride, and you want to go into her every time you're going first for the ride up so you can gain as much advantage as possible with the farming she gets you. If you go second, she's not bad as first stride, but your main stride can make do even without the protect markers, so it's generally dependent on how the game is looking like up to that point for you, but 2 is all you need for the ride up. Zafkiel, our main stride, and she puts in so much work for us. You can choose between getting more power, more drives, or a mix of the two, with the bonus of giving us consistent access to manipulate both the drop and damage zone, making everything you have recyclable, which gives us solid toolboxing, and this is what really makes this deck work. Being able to get up to 6 drives is already amazing, because that's a lot of resources for us, and for your opponent that's dealing actual pressure, because we are a naturally low offense deck, but now, she can just crit people out of the game all by herself. You want to use her to make threatening swings to force out quality cards, while farming and setting up to survive into your opponent's turn, which is why in a prolonged game state, Angels can shine, because they can constantly plus and reuse everything, as well as moving closer to your win con by turtling and grinding out the game. The only real problem with her is that she doesn't flip, probably to future-proof a certain card in here, and she can somewhat conflict with Gavrail's GB2, because this may sometimes be your first stride, meaning that you are only on GB1, but that's okay because the utility she provides is just crazy good and makes a lot of things work. She is the card that you will be going to most of the time, even during the late game, because adjusting the amount of drives you get can prevent deck out and can give power that we lack, making her a solid finisher as well. Really, she saved the clan and this is the best thing that Angels got in years. Gavrail Eden. The one thing that Zafkiel can't really do without other combo pieces is generating a free board and guaranteeing multi-attack. Zafkiel relies on you having a bit of pieces to work with, whereas Eden doesn't really care to an extent. All she really needs is damage and she can call them to attack with, whether it's face up or face down. And she will sometimes come up in simplified game states where you actually need multi-attacking to push through. How good she is usually determined by how good your damage zone is though, which can be really random and unreliable at times, so she's just utility for when Zafkiel doesn't cut it, which is rarely, but it still comes up. Our glorified finisher, Basaseo. She has a damage extension effect to make you lose at 7 or 8, which are effectively heals, but not too crazy unless you know you're playing a slower game where it might matter, but dealing 1 or 2 extra damage nowadays isn't that difficult, so this effect isn't what you should really be aiming for. Her main selling point is her Battle Door skill, which is based on the number of damage you have. So if you're at 5, they must guard 5 or more. On paper, that's pretty good, but the issue is, the cost is very high and doesn't give units power or anything else. It's just a blanket guard restrict and that's it. In this variant, you need external ways like rescue checks to make each attack more difficult to guard, and that's trigger dependent, which makes it inconsistent unless you can map your triggers, which is still inconsistent. There's a lot of ways to answer her in premium, so it's your job to keep track of your opponent's resources and time this right so that it does kill. She's just always a card that you want to threaten with. If your opponent is at high damage and low on resources, she becomes that much more effective. But honestly, Zaphew can sometimes do a better job in closing out games, but she's still important to include for the guard restrict. And finally, G-Guardians. Parashell. She's your biggest free G-Guardian, but she's restricted to Vanguard swings. It's good if you don't have PGs for their Vanguard or for multiple Vanguard swings even. You will very likely have face down cards into your opponent's turn, so she's generally live all the time. Orifiel. Your other free G-Guardian, except this one caps at 20k. With Gavrail's GB2, she technically gained more value. Unlike your other G-Guardians after this, they all have costs that you might not want to use, or you have Parashell who is a lot more conditional. She's costless. Sometimes you just need that free 20k without paying anything, and that really comes up if you don't want to overmill or can't pay the cost. Suriel, your bread and butter. She's kind of like a Matarasu in OTT. She refunds herself, she scries and rescues, so you could potentially hit defenses off of her. If you whiff, she's just a 15k, making her worse than every other G-Guardian in terms of shield value, but still digs for pieces. Also, she accelerates stacking out, so be careful when using her. Our newest G-Guardian. This lets you straight up heal, which in a vacuum is very strong. You can use him to take big attacks instead of guarding, and even gives you more chances to find defensives like you would with Suriel. He is overcosted, which is fair, but they made it so that he conflicts with counterblast heavy cards like Hamiel, and sometimes it comes down to either of those as to whether you survive or you lose. Even though we play cards that offsets their costs, we won't always have them, so you need to be very smart in your plays, like whether you need to swing Hamiel or use this guy to heal up. That aside, he can get really big with the cards he calls, like with OTs, and he can combo with PGs for, a PG. Basically adds even more tankiness to Angels because it's just never enough. And last card, Dismal. It was mainly here for Hanali, but with its errata, it's way less needed now, but now we sometimes superior call Hanali's out during battle with Uriel, so there's still that window that they can pop it. Also, we want to protect our Hamiel sometimes because if you didn't use Hamiel's Counterblast 3, she stays on the board and sometimes we need her for the following turn. Dismal is just great utility for rear guards in general, so he stays for now. And that's the deck. Closing thoughts? It's still in the more casual side, but stronger than casual if that makes sense. They've only gotten better over time, which is super, but the deck is honestly way too fair and doesn't really have anything that's broken to make it worth playing over other decks. The biggest problem you will notice with this deck is the inability to close out games reliably. So you sometimes really have to rely on grinding out your opponent's resources, which can be too slow or straight up be ineffective because there are decks that can out-resource you instead. Or there are decks that scale so hard and don't care about your defensive game as well as your weak offense. You're probably thinking Basaseo, but she's not exactly suited for this clan. For her to be really potent, you would have to play a lot of old gimmicky stuff which are all outdated by today's standards, but you just end up hurting the rest of your deck. What we need is a win con that caters to how modern Angel Feather has become now. Without that, this deck will continue to fall short and won't really be played outside of Gize variants, because Gize has an actual clear win con that works with the rest of the deck. Also, if you want, you can convert into Gize easily with the V-Core, which shows that the core of the deck is decent enough, but we just really need that one broken card to really push it. But as of now, if you're into a more technical type of deck that has cool defensive interactions and likes to drag games, this deck is right up your alley. You'll outlive a lot of decks, it's highly consistent, and you have solid toolboxing which gives us a ton of possibility for deck building. It does take getting used to with the plays and rulings and whatnot, but once you get the hang of it, it's overall a very rewarding deck to play. With some decent piloting and variants, you can definitely steal a lot of wins with this deck. That's the beauty of this game anyways. That about wraps it up. Let us know what you guys want to see next, even though we might take ages to get it out. As always, thanks for watching. Any comments, questions, and all that, let us know. See you guys.